You think you know the people who raised you. You look at your parents and see the architects of your childhood, assuming their lives before you and behind closed doors were as ordinary as your own. But what if the man who taught you how to ride a bike was hiding a monster beneath the floorboards? When 34-year-old Arthur Pendleton inherited his estranged father's lakefront cabin, he expected to find nothing more than dusty furniture, unpaid bills, and the stale smell of regret. Instead, he found a basement door, secured by 3 heavy iron deadbolts, and the nightmare he unearthed behind it didn't just rewrite his family history, it broke a 30-year-old cold case wide open. The call from the attorney came on a damp Tuesday morning. It was brief, devoid of warmth, and carried the heavy finality that only death can bring. Silas Pendleton, Arthur's father, had passed away of a massive coronary at the age of 68. Arthur felt no tears prick his eyes. There was only a hollow, echoing numbness. He hadn't spoken to his father in 7 years. Silas had always been a ghost of a man, a reclusive, obsessive clockmaker who preferred the company of gears, springs, and pendulums over his own flesh and blood. When Arthur's mother died 20 years ago, Silas had practically sealed himself off from the world, retreating to a remote cabin on the edge of Lake Blackwood, Maine. 3 days after the funeral, a sparse affair attended only by Arthur, the attorney, Richard Caldwell, and a gravedigger, Arthur found himself gripping the steering wheel of his SUV, winding down the treacherous, unpaved logging road that led to the property. The trees here grew unnaturally thick, their sprawling branches intertwining to form a dense canopy that choked out the midday sun. When the cabin finally broke through the tree line, it looked less like a home and more like a decaying wooden monolith. It sat dangerously close to the dark, glassy waters of Lake Blackwood. The paint, once a cheerful forest green, had blistered and peeled away, leaving behind gray, rotting timber. A sagging wraparound porch groaned audibly under the weight of the wind. Arthur parked, cut the engine, and stepped out. The silence of the lake was absolute, oppressive. There were no birds chirping, no rustling of wildlife, just the gentle, rhythmic lapping of black water against the rotting pylons of the wooden dock. He unlocked the front door using the brass key Caldwell had given him. The door resisted, its hinges screaming in protest, before giving way to the stagnant air inside. The interior was exactly as Arthur had feared, yet somehow worse. It was a hoarder's paradise of timepieces. Clocks covered every available surface. Grandfather clocks stood like silent sentinels in the corners. Cuckoo clocks were nailed haphazardly to the walls. Mantel clocks, pocket watches, and exposed brass mechanisms littered the dining table, but none of them were ticking. The silence was deafening. "Jesus, Dad," Arthur whispered, running a finger over the thick layer of dust coating a nearby mahogany cabinet. He spent the first few hours throwing open windows, trying to air out the suffocating scent of ozone, dried pine, and old paper. The living room flowed into a narrow, galley-style kitchen, which in turn led to a short hallway containing 2 small bedrooms and a bathroom. It was a modest footprint, but as Arthur walked down the hallway to inspect the master bedroom, he noticed something he had missed. Tucked away in the darkest alcove beneath the staircase leading to the small attic, there was another door. It was entirely out of place. While the rest of the cabin featured flimsy, hollow-core interior doors, this one was solid, untreated oak. It was framed by heavy steel brackets, reinforced like the entrance to a bank vault. But the most unsettling part was the locks. There was no standard doorknob. Instead, 3 heavy-duty deadbolts were installed vertically along the edge. At the very center of the wood, a massive, antique iron padlock hung from a thick steel hasp. Arthur frowned, stepping closer. He reached out and tugged on the padlock. It was cold and unyielding. He rattled the door, but it didn't budge a millimeter. It was built to keep something out. Or, a cold voice in the back of Arthur's mind whispered, to keep something in. He checked the ring of keys Caldwell had provided. There were only 2, the front door and a smaller key that looked like it belonged to a filing cabinet. Neither matched the heavy deadbolts, and certainly not the medieval-looking padlock. Curiosity began to gnaw at him. What could a reclusive clockmaker possibly need to secure with 4 heavy-duty locks in the middle of the Maine wilderness? He pressed his ear against the cold oak. For a long moment, there was nothing. Then, a sound. It was incredibly faint, muffled by the thick wood, but Arthur's breath hitched. It was a slow, rhythmic thump, thump, thump. Arthur stumbled back, his heart hammering against his ribs. He waited, staring at the door, but the sound didn't repeat. He convinced himself it was just the house settling or the water hitting the dock outside. But as the sun dipped beneath the tree line, casting long, menacing shadows across the dusty floorboards, the locked door seemed to loom larger, daring him to find the key. That night, Arthur barely slept. He tossed and turned on the lumpy mattress in the guest room, his mind swirling with memories of his father's erratic behavior during his childhood, the sudden bursts of anger, the long disappearances into his workshop, the frantic whispering behind closed doors, and always the underlying rhythm of the ticking clocks. By morning, the obsession had fully taken root. He wasn't leaving this cabin until he opened that door. He began systematically tearing the house apart. He started in the master bedroom, pulling out dresser drawers, checking under the mattress, sifting through pockets of moth-eaten coats hanging in the closet. He found nothing but mundane artifacts of a lonely life. Old grocery receipts, spare watch batteries, and a few faded photographs of Arthur's mother, Evelyn. By noon, frustrated and covered in dust, Arthur decided to drive into the nearest town, a small fishing village called Oakhaven, about 12 miles away. He needed heavy-duty trash bags, cleaning supplies, and, more importantly, an angle grinder or a pair of bolt cutters. Oakhaven was the kind of town that time forgot. A single main street lined with a diner, a bait shop, a hardware store, and a small library. At the hardware store, operated by a heavy-set man named Bill, Arthur purchased the bolt cutters. As he was paying, Bill squinted at him. "You look familiar, son. You passing through, or staying out by the lake?" "Staying," Arthur said. "I'm Arthur Pendleton. I inherited the cabin out on the North Point." The friendly demeanor vanished from Bill's face instantly. He carefully placed Arthur's change on the counter, pulling his hand back, as if Arthur were contagious. "Silas's boy," he muttered. "Didn't know he had any family left. Most folks thought he just crawled out of the swamp one day." "He kept to himself," Arthur said defensively, though he wasn't sure why he was defending the man. "Kept to himself is one way to put it," Bill said, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper. "You'd do well to sell that land and get back to wherever you came from, Mr. Pendleton. That property. There's a reason nobody goes fishing near the North Point. Your daddy had a reputation. And a bad temper." Arthur wanted to ask more, but Bill turned his back and started restocking a shelf of screws, effectively ending the conversation. When Arthur returned to the cabin, he found he had a visitor. Standing at the edge of the property, staring blankly at the house, was an elderly man in a stained flannel jacket. He was severely hunched, leaning on a walking stick carved from driftwood. Arthur approached cautiously. "Can I help you?" The man turned. One of his eyes was milky and blind. The other was sharp, assessing Arthur with unsettling intensity. "You're the son, the one who got out." "I'm Arthur. Who are you?" "Elias Croft. I own the property on the ridge. Not that there's much of a property line anymore." Elias gestured toward the cabin with his stick. "He's dead, then." "I saw the black car a few days ago. My father passed." "Yes." Elias let out a dry, rasping chuckle that sounded like crunching leaves. "Good. The woods will be quieter now. But I'll tell you what I told the sheriff 10 years ago. Whatever Silas was building down there, it wasn't right. The sounds, boy, the grinding, the digging in the dead of night. You listen to me. If you find a door you can't open, leave it be. Some graves ain't meant to be dug up." Without waiting for a reply, Elias turned and hobbled back into the dense tree line. A chill raced down Arthur's spine. The sounds, the digging. He rushed inside, dropped his bags, and grabbed the brand-new bolt cutters. He marched to the hallway, squaring off against the heavy oak door. He wedged the jaws of the cutters around the thick steel hasp of the antique padlock and squeezed the handles with all his might. His muscles strained, veins popping in his neck. The steel bit into the iron, but it wouldn't snap. He repositioned and threw his entire body weight onto the handles. Snap. The padlock gave way, clattering heavily to the wooden floor. One down, 3 deadbolts to go. But bolt cutters wouldn't work on flush deadbolts. He needed the keys. Arthur moved to his father's workshop, a converted sunroom facing the lake. It was the only room he hadn't searched. It was immaculate, a stark contrast to the rest of the house. Visas, magnifying glasses, and tiny precision tools were lined up on a heavy oak workbench. Arthur scoured the room. Nothing. Frustrated, he slammed his fist on the workbench. The impact rattled a heavy, wooden cigar humidor sitting on a high shelf. Arthur reached up and pulled it down. It was surprisingly heavy. He popped the lid. Inside were dried, crumbling cigars. But the depth of the box didn't match the exterior. Arthur dumped the cigars on the table and pressed his thumbs against the cedar bottom. It gave way with a soft click, a false bottom. He lifted the thin wooden panel. Beneath it lay a heavy ring with 3 identical brass keys, and wrapped in a piece of oiled leather was a small, leather-bound journal. Arthur's hands shook as he picked up the keys. He left the journal on the desk. He didn't care about his father's mad ramblings right now. He only cared about the door. He practically ran to the hallway. He inserted the first key into the top deadbolt. It turned with a heavy, satisfying clack. He moved to the second. Clack. The third. Clack. Arthur gripped the edge of the door frame, took a deep breath, and pulled. The heavy oak door swung outward, revealing a yawning pitch-black void. A wave of air washed over him, and Arthur gagged. It didn't smell like a musty basement. It smelled like bleach, rust, and something sweet, like rotting fruit. He reached around the doorframe and flicked a switch. A row of bare, low-wattage bulbs flickered to life, illuminating a steep set of concrete stairs descending deep into the earth, far deeper than a standard basement should go. Arthur grabbed a heavy Maglite flashlight he had bought in town, gripped the banister, and began his descent. The temperature plummeted with every step Arthur took. The stairs were narrow, the concrete walls on either side slick with condensation. The descent felt endless, spiraling slightly to the left, taking him deep beneath the foundations of the cabin, perhaps even beneath the water table of Lake Blackwood itself. When his boots finally hit the bottom floor, the beam of his flashlight cut through the gloom, revealing a space that made no logical sense. This was not a basement, it was a bunker. The walls were reinforced with thick steel plates, bolted directly into the concrete. The ceiling was low, draped with heavy, black soundproofing foam, the kind used in recording studios or firing ranges. The floor was covered in faded, cracked linoleum tiles that were stained with dark, irregular blotches. "What the hell, Dad?" Arthur breathed, his voice swallowed instantly by the dead acoustics of the room. The space was divided into 2 areas. The first, where he stood, resembled an improvised medical bay or an interrogation room. In the center sat a heavy, vintage dentist's chair, its leather upholstery cracked and peeling. Heavy leather straps hung limply from the armrests and the footboard. Beside the chair was a stainless steel rolling tray holding a variety of rusted tools. Some looked like clock-making instruments, others resembled surgical bone saws. Panic, cold and sharp, seized Arthur's chest. He backed away from the chair, his flashlight beam trembling. He wanted to turn and run up the stairs, lock the door, and burn the cabin to the ground. But the invisible gravity of his father's secrets pulled him toward the second half of the room. Separating the space was a chain-link partition with a simple sliding gate. Beyond the gate, the area was set up like a makeshift office and photography darkroom. A string of drying lines hung overhead, clipped with dozens of curling, yellowed photographs. Arthur walked through the gate and approached the photos. He expected to see pictures of landscapes, or perhaps his father's intricate clock designs. Instead, he saw faces. They were candid, grainy, black and white photos taken from a distance. The subjects were all women. Some were walking out of grocery stores, some were jogging in parks, and others were sitting on porches. They were unaware they were being photographed. At the back of the darkroom area, a massive corkboard spanned the entire width of the wall. It was a chaotic web of red yarn, newspaper clippings, maps, and Polaroids. Arthur stepped closer, shining his light directly onto the center of the board. The largest clipping was a front-page article from the Oak Haven Chronicle, dated the 14th of October 1988. Local teen still missing. Search for Sarah Jenkins enters fourth week. Arthur's breath caught in his throat. 1988. He had been 6 years old. Below the headline was a school portrait of a young girl with bright, hopeful eyes and a smattering of freckles. Next to the article was a map of Lake Blackwood, with a red circle drawn over the exact location of Silas Pendleton's cabin. Pinned beneath the map was a silver locket. Arthur reached out, his fingers brushing the tarnished metal. He recognized it. He had seen a similar one in the police reports he had obsessively read online years ago. Sarah Jenkins had been wearing a silver locket with a swallow engraved on it the day she vanished. He turned the locket over. The swallow was right there, unmistakable. "Oh, God," Arthur whispered, stumbling backward into a metal filing cabinet. His father wasn't just a reclusive clockmaker. He was a predator, a killer. He had kept his trophies down here, in the soundproof dark, directly beneath Arthur's feet, while he slept as a child. Arthur's mind raced. He had to call the police. He had to show them this. The town of Oak Haven had been haunted by Sarah Jenkins' disappearance for nearly 4 decades. The sheriff, Thomas Miller, had been a young deputy when it happened. Arthur spun around to head back to the stairs, but his foot caught on something jutting out from beneath the filing cabinet. It was a heavy, canvas duffel bag. He shone his light on it. The bag was relatively clean, not covered in the decades of dust that coated the rest of the bunker. He nudged it with his foot. It was heavy. Kneeling down, Arthur slowly unzipped the bag. Inside were thick stacks of cash, $100 bills bound in rubber bands. Beneath the money were several passports, all bearing different names, but all featuring the unsmiling, cold face of Silas Pendleton. But it was the item at the very bottom of the bag that made Arthur's blood run ice cold. It was a fresh, pristine newspaper, the Oak Haven Chronicle, dated exactly 1 week ago, 3 days before Silas Pendleton supposedly died of a heart attack in his living room. Arthur stared at the date, his mind unable to process the contradiction. If his father was dead, who brought the paper down here? If his father died a week ago, who packed this bag? Before he could form a cohesive thought, a sound echoed through the bunker. It wasn't a thump, it wasn't the house settling, it was the distinct, heavy sound of the oak door at the top of the stairs slamming shut. Clack. The first deadbolt slid into place. Clack. The second. Clack. The third. Arthur shot up to his feet, screaming into the dark. Hey, wait. He sprinted toward the stairs, taking them 2 at a time, tripping over his own boots, scraping his hands on the concrete walls. He slammed his shoulder against the oak door, beating it with his fists. "Open the door. Let me out." But there was no answer. Only the chilling silence of the cabin above. Arthur was trapped in his father's slaughterhouse. And as the darkness closed in around him, a terrible realization dawned on him. The body they buried 3 days ago might not have been his father at all. Arthur slammed his fists against the unyielding oak until his knuckles bled, smearing crimson across the wood grain. He threw his shoulder into the door, again and again, ignoring the blinding spikes of pain shooting down his arm. It was like throwing himself against a mountainside. The heavy steel brackets and the solid frame didn't give a fraction of an inch. "Let me out," he roared, his voice tearing at his throat. He pressed his ear against the cold wood, praying for the sound of footsteps, a voice, a mistake, but there was only the suffocating silence of the cabin above. He slid down the door, his chest heaving, his breath pluming in the freezing air of the stairwell. Panic, raw and primal, clawed at his insides. He was trapped in a subterranean vault built by a serial killer, and someone very much alive had just locked him in. His father, the newspaper in the duffel bag, the passports, the recent date. The puzzle pieces violently snapped together in Arthur's mind. The body in the casket hadn't been Silas Pendleton. It couldn't have been. It had been a closed casket at the funeral. Richard Caldwell, the attorney, had insisted on it. citing the extensive tissue damage from the massive coronary and the delay in finding the body. Arthur's flashlight flickered, the beam dimming for a heart-stopping second before stabilizing. The batteries were fresh, but the cold was already draining them. He couldn't afford to sit here and panic in the dark. He had to think. He had to survive. He pushed himself off the cold concrete and slowly descended the stairs back into the belly of the bunker. The low-wattage bulbs overhead cast long, sickly yellow shadows across the linoleum. The air felt heavier now, charged with the phantom energy of the atrocities committed in this room. He walked past the horrifying dentist's chair, averting his eyes from the stained leather straps, and moved directly to the filing cabinet in the dark-room area. If his father had orchestrated this elaborate fake death, the answers had to be in these files. Arthur pulled the top drawer. It shrieked in protest. Inside were dozens of thick manila folders. He grabbed a handful and dumped them onto the small desk beside the corkboard. They were dossiers. Meticulous, obsessive dossiers on people from Oakhaven and the surrounding towns. There were schedules, photographs, license plate numbers, and maps detailing daily routines. He recognized some of the faces from the corkboard women who had gone missing in the late 80s and early 90s. Silas hadn't just been a killer. He had been an apex predator, studying his prey with the terrifying precision of a master clockmaker. But Arthur kept digging, tossing the gruesome trophies aside, desperate for something current. In the bottom drawer, hidden beneath a stack of blank photography paper, he found a blue accordion folder. It was surprisingly heavy, secured with a thick rubber band. Arthur snapped the band and opened it. Inside were medical records, not his father's. They belonged to a man named Gregory Higgins. According to the attached police report, Higgins was a homeless drifter who frequently camped in the dense woods bordering the next county over. Arthur pulled out a glossy photograph, paper-clipped to the file. It was a surveillance shot of Higgins. The resemblance was uncanny. Higgins was the exact same height and build as Silas, with the same prominent cheekbones and thinning gray hair. If you put Higgins in Silas's clothes and left him on the floor of the cabin for a few days, a small-town coroner wouldn't think twice, especially with a prominent attorney rushing the paperwork. Caldwell, Arthur whispered aloud, the name tasting like ash in his mouth. The attorney had to be in on it. He was the one who called Arthur. He was the one who handled the estate, pushed for the closed casket, and handed over the keys to the cabin, but conveniently lacked the keys to the basement. But why? Why bring Arthur here at all? If Silas wanted to fake his death and disappear with his duffel bag full of cash, why not just leave? Why lure his estranged son to the property? Arthur flipped to the next document in the blue folder. It was a life insurance policy, a massive one. $3 million, taken out entirely in Arthur's name over a decade ago. But there was a rider attached, a recent amendment drafted by Caldwell's law firm. In the event of Arthur's death, the beneficiary reverted to a shell corporation based in the Cayman Islands. The blood drained from Arthur's face. He wasn't brought here to inherit the estate. He was brought here to die. Silas needed to disappear completely, but a fake death always leaves loose ends, unless there was a tragedy. If the grieving son came to clean out the cabin, discovered his father's horrifying secrets, and in a fit of despair took his own life, the case would be closed forever. The police would find Arthur's body down here with the evidence, the town would have its closure, and the Shell Corporation would quietly absorb $3 million to fund Silas's new life abroad. Arthur stumbled backward, bumping into the corkboard. The pins rattled, a few of the yellowed photographs fluttering to the floor. The sheer, psychopathic brilliance of it paralyzed him. He was supposed to starve down here, or freeze, or perhaps there was another method his father had planned. Suddenly, a sharp, ear-piercing whine filled the room. Arthur covered his ears, dropping the flashlight. The sound was electronic feedback from a microphone. He looked up frantically, scanning the low ceiling. Hidden in the corner, nestled within the black soundproofing foam, was a small, rusted speaker box. The feedback died down, replaced by a soft, rhythmic crackle of static. Then, a voice. Arthur. It was a rasping, gravelly whisper. It was the voice of a man who rarely spoke, a voice Arthur hadn't heard in 7 years, yet it echoed with terrifying familiarity in the marrow of his bones. "Dad," Arthur breathed, staring at the speaker. "I see you found the files." Silas's voice crackled through the intercom. It was devoid of emotion, analytical and cold. "You always were a curious boy, snooping in my workshop, asking questions you didn't want the answers to. Let me out of here, you sick bastard." Arthur screamed at the ceiling. "I know Higgins is in that grave. I know about Caldwell. You won't get away with this." A low, dry chuckle emanated from the speaker. It sounded like gears grinding without oil. "I already have, Arthur. My flight leaves out of Bangor in 4 hours. Caldwell took care of the sheriff. He's very persuasive when motivated by a 7-figure payday. They'll find me. Elias Croft knows I'm here. He saw me today." "Elias is a senile old fool who talks to trees," Silas replied smoothly. "By the time anyone comes looking for you, the oxygen scrubbers in that room will have been off for 3 days. It will be a peaceful sleep, Arthur. Much better than the alternative. I left a lovely letter upstairs on your behalf. You couldn't live with the guilt of what your father did. It's quite poetic." Click. The intercom went dead. Simultaneously, the row of low-wattage bulbs above Arthur's head popped and sizzled, plunging the bunker into absolute, suffocating darkness. Complete darkness is not just the absence of light. It is a physical weight. It pressed against Arthur's eyes, disorienting him instantly. The silence returned, thicker and more oppressive than before, save for his own ragged breathing. He dropped to his hands and knees, frantically sweeping the cold linoleum until his fingers brushed the knurled metal handle of the maglite. He clicked it on. The beam was noticeably weaker now, casting a pathetic, trembling circle of light that barely reached the walls. Silas had turned off the oxygen scrubbers. Arthur didn't know how airtight the bunker was, but given the heavy door and the soundproofing, he guessed he had hours, not days, before the carbon dioxide built up to lethal levels. He had to get out. Now. He swung the flashlight around the room, evaluating his prison. The concrete walls were impenetrable. The steel plates were bolted flush. The oak door at the top of the stairs was out of the question. The digging in the dead of night. Elias Croft's words echoed in Arthur's mind. If Silas had built this place in secret, he couldn't have brought in heavy excavation machinery without drawing attention. He must have dug it out by hand, utilizing existing natural formations or old bootlegging tunnels that were common around Lake Blackwood. Arthur rushed over to the darkroom area. He stared at the massive corkboard covered in the red yarn and newspaper clippings. Why put a corkboard of that size on a solid concrete wall? It took up nearly the entire back of the room. He grabbed the edge of the corkboard and pulled. It was heavy, bolted to a wooden frame. He looked around wildly and his eyes landed on the rusted surgical tools sitting on the stainless steel tray. He sprinted over, grabbed a heavy, metal bone saw and a thick, flathead chisel, and ran back. He wedged the chisel between the corkboard and the concrete wall, hammering the back of it with the handle of the bone saw. Crack. The wood splintered. He moved down a few inches and repeated the process. Crack. Sweat poured down his face, stinging his eyes. His muscles screamed in agony, but adrenaline fueled his frantic strikes. He was fighting for his life against a ghost. With a final, desperate heave, Arthur threw his weight against the chisel. The wooden frame gave way with a loud, tearing groan. The massive corkboard ripped free from the wall, collapsing onto the floor and taking 30 years of horrific trophies with it. Arthur shone his fading flashlight at the exposed wall. It wasn't solid concrete. Directly behind where the center of the board had been, there was a jagged, uneven opening carved into the earth. It was shored up with old, rotting wooden beams. Covering the opening was a heavy, rusted iron grate, secured by 4 massive bolts anchored into the surrounding rock. Arthur dropped to his knees, pressing his face against the grate. A distinct scent hit him: damp earth, decaying leaves, and the metallic tang of fresh water. Lake Blackwood. This was the source of the noise Elias had heard decades ago. Silas had dug a drainage tunnel, or perhaps a discreet exit, to dispose of evidence directly into the deep, black waters of the lake, bypassing the property above entirely. Arthur looked at the thick iron bolts, holding the grate in place. They were rusted solid, fused to the rock by decades of moisture. He wedged the chisel against the head of the top left bolt and struck it with the bone saw. The impact sent a painful shockwave up his arm, but the bolt didn't budge. He hit it again and again. Sparks flew in the dim light. He swung with the fury of a man betrayed, channeling every ounce of hatred he felt for the monster who sired him. Snap! The rusted head of the bolt sheared off. "Yes," Arthur gasped, his lungs burning as the air in the bunker grew noticeably stale. He moved to the next bolt. It took 10 frantic strikes before it snapped. The bottom 2 were harder. He was losing his strength, his vision blurring slightly at the edges as the carbon dioxide levels began to rise. He forced himself to focus, swinging the heavy saw handle like a hammer until his hands were bruised and bleeding. When the final bolt gave way, Arthur grabbed the iron grate and yanked it backward. It fell to the floor with a deafening clang. He aimed the flashlight into the tunnel. It was horrifyingly narrow, barely 3 feet in diameter. It sloped downward at a sharp angle, the earthen walls glistening with moisture. The wooden support beams looked as though they would collapse if breathed on too heavily. And at the very bottom, just at the edge of his fading light, he could see the reflective sheen of black water. There was no telling how far the tunnel went underwater before it opened up into the lake, or if it was blocked by debris. It was a suicide mission, but staying in the bunker was a guaranteed death. Arthur shoved the flashlight into the front pocket of his jacket, gripped the edges of the jagged rock, and forced his shoulders into the hole. The claustrophobia was instant and overwhelming. The damp earth pressed against him from all sides. He had to crawl on his stomach, inching forward like a worm. The smell of rot and stagnant water filled his nose, making him gag. "Don't think," he muttered to himself, his voice muffled by the tight space. "Just move." He shimmied downward. The tunnel was steeper than it looked, and he began to slide, the rough dirt and rocks tearing at his clothes and skin. He dug his boots into the sides to slow his descent, but the earth was too slick. Suddenly, the tunnel leveled out. Arthur hit the bottom with a splash. The water was freezing. It instantly soaked through his jeans and jacket, sending a violent shiver through his core. He pulled the flashlight out of his pocket and clicked it on. The beam was barely a yellow sliver now. It illuminated a terrifying sight. The tunnel continued forward for about 20 feet, but the ceiling dipped drastically. The water level was rising. He wasn't just crawling toward the lake. The lake was seeping in. He scrambled forward on his hands and knees, the freezing water rising from his wrist to his elbows, then to his chest. The ceiling of the tunnel scraped against his back. He had to crane his neck to keep his face above the waterline. 10 feet left. The water was up to his chin. The cold was paralyzing his muscles, turning his limbs to lead. 5 feet? The ceiling dropped again. He was going to have to go under. Arthur took a deep, desperate breath, the last pocket of stale air trapped against the tunnel roof, and plunged his head into the freezing black water. He used his hands to pull himself blindly along the muddy floor of the tunnel. His lungs screamed for oxygen almost immediately. The shock of the cold water felt like thousands of needles piercing his skin. He kicked his legs, desperate to find the exit. His hands hit something solid. Wood. He felt around frantically in the pitch black. It was a lattice of thick wooden planks, a grate. Silas had covered the underwater exit to prevent animals or divers from finding it. Arthur pushed against the wood with his hands, but he had no leverage underwater. His chest convulsed. The urge to inhale water was becoming unbearable. He was going to drown in the dark, inches away from freedom, while his father flew away to a new life. No. Arthur planted his boots against the muddy floor, gripped the wooden lattice with both hands, and pulled with a strength born entirely of sheer, primal rage. He visualized Silas's cold face. He visualized the innocent faces on the corkboard. With a sickening crunch, the waterlogged wood splintered and gave way. Arthur shoved himself through the opening. The narrow confines of the tunnel vanished, replaced by the vast, open expanse of Lake Blackwood. He kicked wildly, swimming upward toward the faint, shimmering moonlight penetrating the surface above. He broke the surface, gasping violently, sucking in massive lungfuls of crisp, freezing night air. He thrashed in the water, coughing and choking, staring up at the brilliant canopy of stars. He was alive. He treaded water, orienting himself. He was about 50 yards out from the rotting wooden dock of his father's cabin. The house stood dark and silent against the tree line, a monument to decades of horror. Arthur swam toward the shore, his body numb, his movements sluggish. When his boots finally touched the muddy bank, he dragged himself out of the water and collapsed onto the freezing grass, shivering uncontrollably. He lay there for several minutes, letting the reality of his survival wash over him. But the relief was short-lived. Silas had said his flight was leaving out of Bangor in 4 hours. That was before Arthur started breaking down the wall. He had no idea how much time had passed, but he knew he didn't have long. Silas and Caldwell thought he was dead. They thought they had won. Arthur slowly pushed himself to his feet, water pouring from his clothes. He looked toward the unpaved logging road. His SUV was still parked where he had left it. The keys were in his pocket. He wasn't going to call the local police. Caldwell had the sheriff in his pocket. He needed someone outside of Oakhaven. He needed the state police, and he needed them at the Bangor airport before a dead man boarded a plane. Arthur marched toward his truck, a cold, unyielding resolve replacing the panic in his chest. Silas Pendleton had spent his life building traps in the dark. It was time to drag him out into the light. Arthur threw himself into the driver's seat of his SUV, his violently shivering hands fumbling with the keys. The engine roared to life, and he slammed the heater dial to maximum. He didn't wait for the cabin to warm up. He threw the truck into gear and tore out of the overgrown driveway, his tires spinning and spitting mud into the black water of the lake. The digital clock on the dashboard read 11:14 p.m. If Silas was telling the truth about his flight leaving in 4 hours, Arthur had lost nearly an hour and a half, breaking through that wall and nearly drowning in the drainage tunnel. Bangor International Airport was an hour and 45 minutes away in good weather. He had less than an hour to intercept a ghost. He rocketed down the unpaved logging road, the high beams cutting through the dense Maine woods like frantic searchlights. Every shadow looked like a trap. Every bump in the road felt like a blown tire that would end his only chance at justice. Arthur knew he couldn't stop in Oakhaven. Sheriff Thomas Miller was in Caldwell's pocket. If Arthur walked into the local precinct, spouting a wild story about his dead father being alive, Miller would simply lock him in a holding cell for psychiatric evaluation, while Silas's plane soared over the Atlantic. He needed state jurisdiction. He needed the feds. He hit the asphalt of State Route 9, pushing the SUV to 80 miles an hour. The heater blasted his soaked clothes, filling the cab with the smell of swamp water and copper from his bleeding knuckles. 20 miles outside of Oakhaven, Arthur's prayers were answered by the glare of reflective decals. Sitting in the gravel median of a dark intersection was a Maine State Police cruiser. Arthur didn't pull over politely. He slammed on his brakes, putting his SUV into a controlled skid that sent a shower of gravel raining against the side of the police cruiser. He threw his door open and stumbled out into the freezing night, holding his hands in the air. The trooper was out of his car in an instant, his service weapon drawn and leveled squarely at Arthur's chest. "Stop right there. Keep your hands where I can see them." "Please," Arthur shouted, his voice cracking. "I'm not armed. My name is Arthur Pendleton. You have to listen to me." The trooper, a broad-shouldered man whose nameplate read Garrison, didn't lower his weapon. "Turn around and interlace your fingers behind your head. Now." Arthur complied, the cold wind biting through his damp clothes. "My father is Silas Pendleton. He's the man they buried in Oakhaven 3 days ago, but it's not him. He murdered a drifter named Gregory Higgins and faked his own death. He's boarding a flight out of Bangor right now, and he's taking millions of dollars with him. Richard Caldwell, the attorney, is helping him." Garrison stepped forward, patting Arthur down with swift, professional efficiency. When he found no weapons, he stepped back, keeping one hand on his holstered gun. He shone his heavy maglite over Arthur, taking in the soaked clothes, the bruised face, and the shredded, bloody hands. "You look like you just crawled out of a grave, son," Garrison said, his tone shifting from aggressive to fiercely analytical. "I practically did," Arthur gasped. "He locked me in a bunker under his cabin. He's a serial killer. Sarah Jenkins, the girl who went missing in 1988, her locket is down there. I saw it, along with photos of dozens of other women. That made Garrison freeze. Every cop in the state of Maine knew the name Sarah Jenkins. It was the white whale of local law enforcement. Garrison unclipped his radio. "Dispatch, this is Unit 4, Bravo. I need to connect with Detective Captain Sean O'Rourke. Major crimes. Wake him up if you have to. I have an individual claiming to have material evidence regarding the 1988 Jenkins disappearance and a suspect in active flight." It took less than 2 minutes for O'Rourke to get on the radio. Garrison held the receiver to Arthur's mouth. Arthur spoke rapidly, detailing the bunker, the dental chair, the files, the fake corpse, and the flight out of Bangor. There was a heavy pause on the other end of the line. Then, O'Rourke's voice, sharp and authoritative, cracked through the static. "Garrison, put him in the back of your cruiser. Leave his vehicle. I'm scrambling the tactical team to Bangor International right now. If this guy is blowing smoke, I'll personally throw him in a cell. But if he's telling the truth, we have exactly 38 minutes to lock down that tarmac." The back of a police cruiser flying at 100 miles an hour with sirens wailing is a sensory overload. But to Arthur, it felt like sitting in a sensory deprivation tank. His mind was entirely fixated on the ticking clock. Tick, tick, tick. His father's entire life had been measured by the precise, rhythmic movement of gears. Every murder, every alibi, every financial transaction, all perfectly synchronized. But Silas had made one catastrophic miscalculation. He underestimated his son's will to live. They arrived at Bangor International Airport at 12:42 a.m., but they didn't go to the main commercial terminal. Following O'Rourke's radioed instructions, Garrison bypassed the main entrance, tearing down a restricted access road toward the fixed base operator FBO terminal, a secluded facility catering entirely to private charters and wealthy corporate clients. 3 unmarked black Subarus and 2 state police cruisers were already parked in a chaotic semicircle near the glass entrance doors. Tactical officers in heavy vests were moving with silent, terrifying speed. Garrison let Arthur out of the back. Detective Captain O'Rourke, a tall man with silver hair and eyes like flint, met them. He looked Arthur up and down. "You Pendleton?" "Yes," Arthur said, his teeth chattering despite the adrenaline. "We ran the flight manifests," O'Rourke said grimly. "There's a Gulfstream 4 chartered under a Cayman Islands holding company, scheduled to depart for Zurich in 10 minutes. We have the pilots detained on the tarmac. We're breaching the VIP lounge now." "He's not alone," Arthur warned. "Richard Caldwell is with him." "Stay behind me," O'Rourke ordered. The officers breached the terminal. There was no shouting, no dramatic countdown. They moved like a flood of black water, pouring through the glass doors and sweeping into the luxurious, dimly lit VIP departure lounge. Sitting in a plush leather armchair, sipping a glass of scotch, was Richard Caldwell. And standing by the floor-to-ceiling window looking out at the grounded Gulfstream with his hands clasped neatly behind his back was the architect of the dark himself, Silas Pendleton. He had dyed his thinning grey hair a stark, unnatural black. He wore an immaculate, tailored charcoal suit, entirely out of place for a reclusive woodsman. The heavy canvas duffel bag sat at his feet. "Richard Caldwell, Silas Pendleton, you are under arrest," O'Rourke's voice boomed across the lounge as 6 tactical officers leveled their rifles at the 2 men. Caldwell dropped his scotch. The crystal shattered on the polished floor, the amber liquid pooling like blood. The attorney threw his hands in the air, his face completely devoid of color, immediately stammering, "I want immunity. I can give you everything. The shell companies, the payoffs to Miller, all of it. I want a deal." But Silas didn't flinch. He didn't raise his hands. He simply turned around, his movements slow and deliberate, perfectly measured. His eyes bypassed the heavily armed tactical team. They bypassed Captain O'Rourke. His cold, calculating gaze locked directly onto Arthur, who stood trembling by the doorway, covered in mud, blood, and lake water. For the first time in his life, Arthur saw the mask slip. The arrogant, untouchable clockmaker stared at his son, his meticulously constructed reality shattering into a million pieces. The gears had jammed, the pendulum had stopped. "How?" Silas whispered, the single word carrying across the silent room. Arthur stepped forward, pushing past a tactical officer. He stared into the eyes of the monster who had haunted his childhood. "You build a good cage, Dad," Arthur said, his voice surprisingly steady, "but you forgot the water." Silas stared at him for a long, agonizing moment. Then, slowly, he lowered his head, not in remorse, but in the devastating realization of his own defeat. The officers swarmed him, slamming him against the glass and securing his wrists in heavy steel cuffs. The aftermath of that night rewrote the history of Maine. The excavation of the bunker beneath the cabin took the FBI 3 weeks. Behind the concrete walls, they found the horrifying truth. Sarah Jenkins was returned to her family, along with the remains of 11 other women who had vanished over a span of 3 decades. Sheriff Thomas Miller was arrested by state authorities before the sun even came up. Richard Caldwell's plea deal was thrown out by a furious federal judge, ensuring the corrupt attorney would spend the rest of his life in a maximum security cell adjacent to Silas. As for Arthur, he inherited the $3 million after the fraudulent Cayman accounts were seized and unraveled. He didn't keep a single cent. He established the Blackwood Foundation, dividing the money entirely among the families of his father's victims to pay for counseling, memorial services, and financial support. 6 months after the arrest, Arthur stood on the shoreline of Lake Blackwood one last time. He watched as a crew of heavy excavators and bulldozers tore the rotting cabin down to its foundations. They filled the subterranean bunker with concrete, sealing the darkness away forever. Arthur turned his back on the lake, got into his SUV, and drove away, finally leaving the ticking clocks behind him. Arthur's story proves that the most terrifying monsters don't hide in the woods. They sit at our dinner tables, masking their darkness behind the mundane ticking of everyday life. The bravery it took to confront his own father's legacy not only saved Arthur's life, but finally brought peace to dozens of families who had spent decades waiting in the dark. It is a chilling reminder to trust your instincts, because sometimes the ghosts of the past are very much alive, waiting just beneath the floorboards. If this story kept you on the edge of your seat and you want to hear more true crime survival stories, hit that like button, share this video with your friends, and make sure to subscribe to the channel. Drop a comment below. What would you have done if you found that locked door?